When we are sexually abused as young children, we have no capacity to make any sense of such a horrific event. And most of the time, we don't have the vocabulary to tell anyone what had happened to us. So how can we as parents and adults who work with children help them and support them when they reach out to us to disclose sexual abuse? My guest today is John Cardamone, who's here to share his story and some great work that he's been doing on this topic. John, thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Thank you. And thank you so much for providing the opportunity for people like myself. You give us an opportunity and a platform to be able to share our story. So thank you.
It's a privilege. So, John, tell us your story and what led you to where you are today with the work that you do.
Yeah, so born and bred in Australia, Victoria, Melbourne. Um, so yep, still here, still in the same suburb or region where I was born. And I come from an Italian background. So dad born in Italy. Even although my mum was born in Australia, I came from a very strict Italian background where there was no English or whatsoever. But they came out here for a better life, and really pretty much an Italian a traditional family. So pretty strict and in that sort of way, but very family orientated. Um, so had a pretty stereotypical normal upbringing until I was at the age of 6 when I was starting to get sexually abused from a family member. This was ongoing for 2 years, um, which was a very difficult time, as you could imagine, and as you said in your intro, really difficult for me to disclose. And I remember a number of times I was trying. But to give your listeners a bit of context, every Sunday I would go to the abuser's house, my parents not knowing what was going on. But I think for your listeners to remember that perpetrators groom children, but they also groom parents to build
Mm.
that trust. And that's certainly what he did. Um, and uh, again, this was ongoing. So during that time, I do remember lots of different times trying to disclose, but I just couldn't get the words out. And I think in different ways, I was disclosing through my behavior. And behavior is absolutely a form of communication. And I was trying to, through meltdowns, tantrums, I would make myself physically ill and vomit if I knew I was going to the perpetrator's place. And um, during this time, my parents were so worried that I was seeing a psychiatrist for nearly close to 2 years, and even the professional, I wasn't able to disclose to him what was happening. Finally, after 2 years, I remember being in the laundry with my mum and just breaking down and just telling her what was happening. And I'll never forget the words that I said after I disclosed to her. It was, "You believe me, mummy, you believe me, mummy." And now that I'm an educated adult, children just want to be believed, validated, and feel acknowledged. So that's a really important aspect of my work that I am doing today around disclosure and how to respond effectively and appropriately.
Sure. Thank you for sharing that. I relate to it so much because I was also sexually abused, starting at the age of 4. And I had to enter my 50s before I was able to disclose to my family members what had happened. I did disclose in my early 20s when I was with a therapist, but not fully. So yes, the disclosure is very, very difficult. And like I said in the beginning, especially if we don't really know what it was that happened, what it means, we don't have the vocabulary. Hey? Yeah.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing. I know that can be really hard for for anyone to share. So I appreciate you being open and honest and vulnerable. Um, and yep, it's really common that people don't disclose. I think there's some data around that it takes 23 years for someone to disclose.
Mhm.
Um, I, I think what helps with disclosure, and every story is different, but is the connection that you have. And I'm
Mm,
really big on attachment theory, and I had a really secure attachment to my mum,
mm,
um, and emotionally attached. So for your listeners, I would highly recommend to Google or to search attachment theory and the importance of how to build that with your children, um, because that's exactly what my mum had. And when it comes to disclosures, my mum had no expertise, or English was her second language. Um, but the way you respond to a disclosure can either start the healing process or it may prolong it. So
yes. Mhm.
that's why it's critical, and you don't have to be a professional how to handle disclosure. You just need to be. I used to say a decent human. You don't even have to be decent. You just need to be someone that listens and knows just how to respond.
Mm,
So happy to get into that a little bit more, but yeah, just wanted to, I guess, share. That's kind of my work that I do
yes.
at the moment.
I know you developed a response framework, and we'll get into that in a bit. But I want to just take a moment to ask you. You remembered the first thing you said after you disclosed your mother's that worry that she would not believe you. Do you believe me, Mom? Did she
Mm,
believe you? And what happened then, if you're comfortable to talk about that?
absolutely. My mum believed me right away, and the way she responded, and this is why I've created a framework. The way she responded was she didn't question me. She didn't look at me funny. She didn't raise her eyebrows. Um, she didn't say things, or were they only playing, or maybe it was a joke.
Mm,
Um, there's that generation of, and even still to this day, a little bit of sweeping it under the carpet and protect the family name. The family name, especially in the Italian family, it's really important. Um, but my mum responded right away. The police were called. They arrived, and they believed me too, which that's not always the case,
mm,
unfortunately. Um, so I was able to get early intervention quite quickly through GPs, psychologists, psychiatrists, did a lot of play therapy. Um, and that is definitely my biggest healer today. Me being believed, acknowledged, and validated. And I'll be saying that a lot because as adults, if we don't feel validated with whatever we're doing, that can really affect us in lots of different ways. But
oh, yes.
when you think about the child, and the younger you are, when you go through trauma, the bigger the impact that it has on the brain.
Mm.
So yeah, that's, I guess, those three big things of being believed, acknowledged, and validated are crucial, and that's how my mum responded.
Wonderful. Absolutely amazing. I'm so glad to come across a parent who does that every time I meet them. Um, Thinking of my own story, I'm still not believed by many.
Mm,
So, you can't
yeah,
even get over that first hurdle of people actually
yeah,
believing what had happened. And then
yeah,
also, in terms of the disclosure, what makes it difficult is you mentioned also earlier, if a lot of time goes by before you actually disclose it, makes it harder, I think, for people to believe you.
mm,
And the matter of protecting the family, I believe it's also well documented, the extent to which family members will go, especially in
mm,
certain cultures, to protect the
mm.
perpetrators and to literally sweep the abuse under the rug. So it's something that's quite common. Is that your experience too?
Um, Not a little bit with, one or two family members, but my experience, I would have to say I'm really fortunate, even though I went through a horrific experience. I was still really fortunate that, 99.9 of my family acted protectively, protected me. And I believe the way I am, the way that I am today, and I'm able to speak about so openly about my experience is because my healers and what I share is my foundation is having lots of connections and a sense of belonging. And I really think those two things really help shape the brain, especially a developing brain. And I was really lucky before and after the abuse. I was really lucky to have those. So I think without those two things, and you think about if your listeners know about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what's the foundation of what children and people need? It's, food, water, shelter, love, and security.
Yes.
Um, so, although it's really simple, but it's also really complex because of the, different situations we can find ourselves in.
Mm, very true. And if I may ask, what happened to the perpetrator? Was the person prosecuted?
Yeah, yep, absolutely. They were convicted. So this was back in the early 90s. Even today, uh, when people get convicted around this, the sentences don't match the crime, and that certainly was the case back in the early 90s. Bit of a slap on the wrist, but I think, again, I think the important part is that he was convicted, and that's another sense of validation that I have. Um,
Mm,
that even though it wasn't, I don't think was sufficient. Um, but I guess what I've got the paper to say this is what's happened, and again that
mm.
just gives validation that it was also validated in courts, which is I think an important part of the process of
Officially.
of feeling healed anyway.
Mhm. I think for many people who have had no legal recourse, there are some wounds that remain open and things that one can't get closure on
Mm.
when that's the case. Sure. Yeah, it's a horrible thing to experience for any child, and the sexual abuse is something that just simply should never happen. And sadly, it happens much more than I think most people are aware. But let's look at your response framework that you developed. You've mentioned validation a number of times, and I know that's very important, the acknowledgement, the validation that comes with it. Tell us about your response framework.
Yeah, so I think with any framework, if it's too hard, um, it can be it's it's too hard. So I wanted to develop a framework because since I've been in this line of work, if you like, and sharing my story, it's um, I just thought everyone was believed. Like I just thought I was
Mm,
believed. This is how it's handled.
mm,
But I'm finding that is not the case.
mm.
I was finding that adults had no idea how to respond to a disclosure because they're really uncomfortable, had no idea. And fair enough, it can be difficult.
And you're
But I think
shocked,
as
I
adults,
suppose. Sorry.
absolutely. No, 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 no. You're right. Shocked, surprised, and but I'm a firm believer that it's every adult's responsibility to protect children, and we know that there's bad adults out there and criminals, but on a whole, it's up to every adult. And I think part of that is to know what to do if it doesn't even have to be disclosure, a concern, a worry. We need to know how to respond. So I came up with something that was easy to remember. So it's called Be Calmer because one of the most important things with a disclosure is that you need to be calm. And
Mm,
the example I like to give is if a child's having a tantrum and meltdown, if the parent's screaming and matching that, well, you're just entering the ring, So
yes.
um, the best way to respond is for you to be calm and wait the tantrum out.
Mhm,
This is no different. So if we responded that we're shocked and we're all nervous and we're moving around, you know, that could really send that person uh, to a state of not wanting to disclose ever again. So I came up with be calmer,
mhm,
to be calm, and each letter stands for something. Um, so B obviously being well, not obviously, but is to believe and validate.
mhm,
Um, 'Cause believing someone can really mitigate these negative effects and contribute to their pathway to healing. As I shared, um, pardon me, I just had a tea. Um, if if they are not, if the child especially is not believed in that moment, that can even be worse than the actual trauma that they're
Mm,
gone through, and that can really prolong the trauma. So the first thing is to believe and validate. And they sound like big words, but it's not. Validating is just nodding, looking, and paying
mhm,
attention.
mhm,
That would be the first part. E is to engage. So we need to be showing with our body language that we are engaged and ready to listen. So when I say engaged, phones are a big issue. They're great, but in terms of, if even if there's a ring, or you're looking at the phone, you're just not engaged, and that can really again hurt,
mhm,
unvalidate the child.
mm,
C is for calm, so we need to be calm. So this could be the absolute difference between someone opening up or not wanting to speak about it ever again. A is to acknowledge, so acknowledge their emotions without any judgment. So you might say, that sounds really challenging, or I can understand why you feel that way. L is to listen. So make sure you are listening, not just with your ears, but also the way you are sitting and how you position yourself, and having absolutely no distractions. And also, when we're listening, I think with children, they might not want to look you in the eye.
mm,
So it's really important that they might be fidgeting, and it doesn't mean that they're not engaged, but that's what they feel comfortable with, even with adults. M is to maintain self care. So disclosure can be hard to hear. So it's important to look after yourself and check in with someone that will absolutely listen to you. E is to extend support. So always thank the person for disclosing and provide ongoing support if appropriate. And R is to respond appropriately. So respect the person's privacy. So don't share their disclosure with others without their permission. However, in some cases, you might need to report this. So where I'm from, we have something called child protection, and they're a governing body that we need to call if we feel or suspect child abuse. So
mm,
that's it in a nutshell. Um, and I do training for some organisations. I'm doing one next month for an organisation that does training for frontline workers, because we know
mhm.
with police, ambulance, doctors, they
Yes.
hear a lot of disclosures. So I'm even potentially doing one with the bank. And when
Mm,
people say, "Why on earth are you doing with the bank?" Well, you think of a lot of domestic violence. Women are usually calling the bank to, do lots of different things to protect themselves. So usually bank tellers and banks are hearing a lot of disclosures, and the way they respond can, yeah, really make an impact.
yes. That's quite interesting. And I have to just mention that there is a document that one can download from your
For,
website with this framework, and we'll share the link wherever we post this video for people to access. It's available for free.
Absolutely, it is. It's on the website under free resources. I've got some other free resources, but that's absolutely for free on the website.
Mm. I think it's absolutely wonderful that you developed that. And because you have lived experience yourself, it makes it so much more valuable because you've been there, you've experienced this yourself. And it makes perfect sense to me. It's a calm way to respond, and that we need to be aware of our body language and how well we're engaged. And again, the responses afterwards. So we can't express our shock or disbelief when a child discloses sexual abuse. We need to remain calm. We can't even comment on what they said, like something like, oh, let me get to him, or, wait until I get my hands on
Mm,
her, something like that.
no,
Even if we're angry, it's very, very important that we don't disclose, that we remain composed and calm. Hey.
yep, absolutely. Even to the point of, maybe trying to do good, but by asking too many questions.
Mm,
So that can also be a barrier for people
mhm,
to continue to disclose. So silence, is really powerful. But again, every context and every situation and every child, everybody is different.
Mm,
But I truly believe if you follow that clear structure, it's open to interpretation. It's not really strict, and it shouldn't be. But
mm.
that's the foundation: being calm, being engaged, being able to respond and make appropriate reports if needed. So, um, yeah, and I think when I say thinking about your body position, I work in a school, so I deal with lots of children and families, and some people don't like to sit across from each other. So sometimes children want to sit side by side, getting Lego out. So all those little things are really important. Um, and depending on the relationship you have, there's a famous quote that children won't learn from people that they don't like, and that's no
Mm,
different with connections and relationships. They're
mm.
definitely not. Well, some of the time they might disclose to someone that they don't know, but the better the relationship, if they feel safe, there's a better odds and chances of that happening.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm thinking of a client that I had who was driving in the car, and the child sitting next to her actually disclosed this whole story of sexual abuse while they were driving. So
Mm,
I thought of that when you mentioned they don't necessarily want to make eye contact. And if the child has chosen their timing and their setting for this disclosure, it's important that we honor that. And like, for example, if we're driving in the car, not necessarily stop, pull off the road and say, look at me, but rather
mm,
continue driving and keep the conversation
yeah,
flowing so that they can get out as much as they've have the courage to get out.
absolutely. And like you hit the nail on the head, in terms of you need to stay calm,
Mm,
because if you don't, that could really scare. Um, And this applies to adults. It's not just children. Because in Australia, I'm not sure about um, in South Africa, but I think there's like something 70% of adults that work in the workforce
mm-hmm,
have been or currently going through trauma. So there's
mm,
lots of disclosures in the workplace.
yes.
And the other thing I wanted to bring up, and some of the work that I'm leading into, is that I've got the framework, but we're also I want to try and support organisations that are we setting up the preconditions to allow people to feel like they have permission to disclose? Because unfortunately, lots of children and for lots of people, their house, their home is not a safe place. Their
Mm,
safest place is either school or at work.
mm,
So I'm just in the middle of creating another framework called Be Aware, and that
mm-hmm,
all stands for something. But essentially, it's creating the preconditions before anyone even steps up or steps into a workplace. But what does
mm,
that look like? The environment for someone to be able to disclose.
mm. Very, very important. I love that you're doing. I saw that, and I think we'll share that link also once that's up and ready. But you very, very valid. I loved what you said also about sharing that information with their permission. So it's very important that when somebody discloses to us that we ask for their permission or check in with them, um, whether it's okay with them if we share that information, except for in circumstances where we're dealing with vulnerable children and we are required by law to report such a thing. But it's also still better to get their permission and their cooperation, or I want to almost say, buy-in, because there will be
Yeah,
consequences after that.
abs- absolutely. And people say, "Oh, you don't want to lie to children if you have to make a mandated report."
Mm,
And it's absolutely not lying. It's being honest and say, I need to tell someone else to keep you safe, to keep
mm,
me safe, and this is what I'm going to do. Because with children, um, they don't like unpredictability. Even adults don't. So making things predictable, telling them step by step what you are going to do, and that in this case that you don't have any choice, um, and by law, and the way you explain it, it can be in lots of different ways, but I think what's important is that they know what is happening next and why.
Yes, yes, I agree. Yeah, very, very important. And then I'm curious to know what your experience is in the work that you do. What I've experienced is when a child discloses, or anybody for that matter, but specifically children, it's important to not bombard them with questions about the details of what happened, because we might contaminate the story or the evidence. And from a legal point of view, it's important that we actually just leave it at that and wait for that child to either be reveal the details of what happened in a play therapy session, or with a qualified, properly trained person who knows how to pose those questions and how to get the correct information out of them. If we bombard them with questions, how did this happen? What did they do?
Mm.
When, what, and then we might confuse them. What is your experience about that?
So my experience is, and what's really important is to understand your role in that situation.
Mm,
So what is your role in a situation that someone or a child is disclosing to you? Your role is to listen. Your role is not to investigate. Your role is to listen and make a report and respond appropriately. Because
mm,
the moment we go outside of our role or outside of the lane, that's when we can really crash. So
mm,
if you work in a school and there's a disclosure, your role is to listen and to make a mandated report. And
mm,
then those people that you make a report to, it's their job to investigate. As humans, we really caring and we're really empathetic, and sometimes that can do more damage because, like you said, we want to question and we want to save the world and that sort of thing. That's really noble. But in this case, we're not investigators. We listen and we can provide ongoing support. Like I work in a school and I do that, whether it's a mandated report or not, because that's part of my role to provide ongoing support. But
mm,
it's absolutely not my role to investigate and question and probe
mm,
about the explicit details of what's happened. So I think that's a really, really important uh, aspect to remember.
mm. And I think that's well said. I love how you said, remember that our role is to listen, not to investigate. We'll leave that to properly trained people to do that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and as I was saying, as humans, we just, of course, if a child discloses, we want to bring them home and we want to
Mm,
care for them, and
mm,
that's really nice that we want to do that. But unfortunately, in today's world, it's not how it was. We've got a lot of things and boundaries put in place for good reason. But I think for your listeners that work in this kind of space and they're kind of not sure what to do, it's just playing your role and staying in your lane.
mm.
That's really important.
Yeah. And talking about that, the next thing that comes to mind for me is I'm aware now that I should just be the listener and provide support and not investigate. But now I might also have the urge to go and confront the perpetrator. What is your
Mm.
advice on that?
Ah. Absolutely not, because you could absolutely do damage to an investigation potentially.
Mhm,
Um, and not just that, you could break trust of the child or the person if they do find out. Again, um, you'd be and it could be potentially dangerous. But also, um, that's not your role unless you're an authority figure that is investigating.
mhm,
So highly advised not to do that because that wouldn't be your role. As much as we empathize and we get angry and we want to take control and get back at the person, it's absolutely not the right thing to do, even though we have these feelings of wanting to jump in and protect. But the best thing that you can do and be a protective person is to follow my approach, but also just generally listen, not investigate, report. But in terms of that, what's really important, you need to intervene as an adult and saying, okay, I'm having these really strong feelings. I need to talk to someone. I need to
mm,
just, whether it's a manager or a supervisor, even someone at home, just get it off your chest, because sometimes when we're in the moment, we're not thinking straight, and sometimes we just need time to pass. Um, so I would highly advise to check in with someone, and that's why part of my framework is to check in.
Yeah, take care of yourself also, because it can have a profound impact also to hear a disclosure like that. And it might be about someone close to you, or someone that you trust or look up to, or someone with who plays a significant role in your life. It's quite shocking to hear such bad news. So yeah, we need to take care of ourselves also.
I just want to, yes, taking care of ourselves is very important. But I think the other aspect to this, so that's my framework's a very reactive strategy, and it's a really important strategy because unfortunately in this world, we're going to have more disclosures no matter what we do.
Mm,
But in my other work that I do, I'm all about prevention.
mhm,
So prevention is, I find it really easy, but for people that don't understand, it's not common sense. But it's about having these conversations with our children or children really early, like
mm,
using the medical terms of our private body parts. Really
mhm,
understanding that children, their mouth is also a private body part. Yes, you can see it's not private, and you can kind of dig into the reasons of why the mouth is a body part. Um, and it's identifying trusted adults with children. It's explaining what does unsafe and safe feel like, because we as
yes.
adults we think that children just should know what these things feel like. I mean, we teach maths, reading, and writing
Mm,
every day, all of the time, and we accept that, oh, fractions are pretty hard and decimals are hard, so we'll keep teaching every year. But the knowing what's safe and unsafe, we need to be having these conversations all of the time, not just once off.
mhm.
So I saw that you want to say something, but yeah,
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's important that we prepare our children in an age-appropriate manner without making them scared to venture out in the world also, hey? But they need to be aware of their own privacy, what's safe and not, and to trust their instincts, because instinctively they will feel uncomfortable or feel that something's not appropriate. And I think it's very important to teach children to act on that when they feel that way, and that they can walk away or remove themselves or say no. Those are some of the important things we need to teach them.
yeah. And with children, I've also got another framework on my website that children just need a three-step process. If you're feeling unsafe, what can you do? Say, stop, I don't like it. What
Mm-hmm.
happens if you continue to feel unsafe? I can move to a safe place. What happens if that person follows you? Find a trusted adult. And
Mm,
the other thing too, and I could go on forever, just tell me to stop. But the other aspect, I'm not sure what it was like in South Africa, but especially in Australia, we were teaching of lots about stranger danger. And I
yes.
really believe that absolutely needs to change.
Mm-hmm.
So in this country, in Australia, 90% of sexual abuse cases are from either a family member or a
Mm,
close friend. So
yeah.
they're not strange. So
Mm,
we, instead of teaching stranger danger, we need to be teaching about what strange behaviours are. Because
yes,
unfortunately,
exactly. Mm,
some of our family members are the most dangerous people. And your listeners might be strangers, but they might be the most caring people and act protectively. So with my children, I front load them, and if we're going to a footy match, I'll say, if you get lost, you need to find a stranger with a red jacket on, or
mm,
depending on what event we're going on, I usually know what. And my kids will say, "Oh, why, Daddy? Aren't they strangers?" Yes, but they work at the place, and they're a safe stranger. Or what
mm,
about if they turn into an unsafe stranger? Which is a great question.
mm.
Um, so, and what does that look like? So it's
Mm,
just having these conversations all of
yes.
the time.
Yeah, that must be just open topics that are discussed whenever it becomes relevant, whatever situation you are in. Well said. Yeah. So, John, I'm also curious to know what you think about um, you mentioned the ways that you behaved that could have indicated to the people around you what had happened. Something I struggled with for a long time in my life was the simple question that could my parents not notice that something was up? Could they not see in my behavior that I was not a happy child, that something had happened to me, or that my behavior had changed, or that I had changed? You know, children go from being carefree and spontaneous to, withdrawn and quiet and maybe acting out in other ways. Can we talk a little bit about what are those signs? And of course, every situation is unique and every child responds in their own unique way. But could you perhaps share some of your experiences of what are the telltale signs, if we can even call them that something is up, something has happened to a child that we can be on the lookout for?
Yeah. So apart from physical abuse, in terms of what you can actually see, like
Mm,
bruises and that sort of thing, when we're talking about the iceberg, so what's under the water,
mm,
that's hard to see. So the big thing is changing. So we talk about challenging behavior, but we
mm,
also need to look at changing behavior. So in my experience, my I was having challenging behavior, but before that, my behavior changed quite rapidly.
mm,
Um, so what I mentioned that is if it's unusual behavior. So I was never really aggressive little boy, but I was being aggressive. I was being verbally aggressive. Um, I was starting to withdraw, as you shared, isolate. And we
mm,
know when people and adults start to isolate and withdraw, you can fall in a really deep hole really quickly. And that's why
mm,
they shared loneliness is like the biggest killer as we get older, as they say. Um, so looking for unusual behaviours, especially in children, because sometimes they display or mimic, not all of the time,
mm,
but sometimes they might. But sometimes children are really great at hiding things, and
mm,
that's also a sign too. But again, the biggest thing to look for is change in behavior, unusual behavior, because as I was saying, every behavior is a form of communication. We
mm,
just got to work out what children are trying to tell us.
mm,
It can absolutely be tricky. I was having great anxiety. I was always looking behind me because I was thinking he was following me. I would shake out.
mm,
So these things aren't usual. They're not normal behaviours. Yes, anxiety is on the rise in children. I think across the globe. However, that kind of anxiety is not normal, and that's why I was going to see a professional because my parents had no idea what was going on. So obviously they could see my change in behaviour, and they thought some professional help. Um, but hopefully that gives a little bit of clarity. But there's no book on uh, what's black and white in terms of what to look out
mm,
for. I think the
mm.
change in behaviour is a big one.
Big indicator. And you know the children in your life, you know your own children, or when you're a teacher or somebody who works with children, you get to know them. So it is possible to notice a change in their demeanor. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it comes back to having a great connection and relationship. But that's the basis of human
Mm,
need is having
mm.
relationships and connection.
Yeah, very true. Wow. There's so much that we need to know, so much that we can learn. But I'm very grateful for you sharing your story and telling us about your work. You've been quite busy developing frameworks and putting it out there for people to access. I think it's very, very valuable. And for anybody who's watching this video, please look in the description or the comments. You'll find links to all these products that we've discussed here. We'll share them with you. Sure. Yeah. John, I want to just also ask you, um, looking back now on your life, how old are you now?
I'm 39, nearly
39.
40.
Good. You're getting to the best years.
Yeah, yeah. So they say. Yep.
Looking back on your life and that experience that you had as a young boy, how do you think it has impact? Is there any way that it still impacts you? How do you think we know we carry these things with us? Obviously, you did say you had good help and therapy from professionals, and you're fortunate to have had a good attachment with your mom. But how does it affect one long term in your experience? And
Mm.
maybe from the people that you've worked with, you can share something.
Yeah, so um, it impacts people differently. So it's probably well known that people that go through any kind of abuse that's complex, so ongoing, especially, they can fall in go on the road or pathway to addiction with drugs, alcohol,
Mm,
um, risky behaviours. Um, so I hear a lot of that. I hear a lot about males in particular being really angry,
mm,
and that's so. If you look at the statistics in Australia, anyway, lots of men that are in youth justice or jail, a huge percentage have either been through trauma or abused.
mm, mm,
Um, so I think for me, getting that help has been absolutely vital. But not just the help, but being connected and having a sense of belonging, not just at home, but in the community. So really,
mm,
I'm always very sporty. So sporting clubs have played a huge role in having that
mm.
sense of belonging. Because when you have sense of belonging, you have a sense of safety, and
Yes.
I think that's really undervalued. What that feels like, especially for children. But the impacts that it's had on me, and I think more commonly, as I was saying, the younger you are when you are go through trauma or being abused, that really impacts the development of the brain. And the way that it's been explained to me is the more your brain is in a fight, flight, or freeze mode, the more your brain's going to be in that mode as you get older. So that
Mm,
creates anxiety, depression, OCD, etc.,
mm,
etc. So for me, mine's kind of been anxiety. So deal with it pretty good, but I used to get really high anxiety to the point where I was like a headless chook running around.
mm,
I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to move. Um, but in terms of triggers, I've been pretty lucky in terms of not being triggered because I've got memories of what happened, and unfortunately, they're pretty good memories. Um, so I've learned not to engage with those memories when they do come. But I was certainly triggered. I had a huge trigger about 2 years ago that really derailed me for a little bit, and it was quite unexpected because I'm usually a pretty resilient person because I've got a positive mindset. I'm always busy. I've got two beautiful kids and a beautiful wife, um, and and that really keeps me grounded and grateful and that sort of thing. But I was triggered with my son um, was pretty close to the age of when I started to get abused, and I would think back to those times of exactly what was happening in the same environment with the same person, but I was replacing myself with my son,
mm.
and I don't know why that just really triggered me. So I really needed to seek help and get past that, which I have. It doesn't bother me at all, but it was just a trigger that I needed to work through. So that was pretty significant, and those intrusive thoughts. I think most of us have those at different levels, but that was pretty significant. So I think it impacts us in lots of different ways. Um, for me, that's probably been my only or biggest trigger um, since I was 8, 9 years old. Anyway.
It's interesting. I actually would like to share two things that happened to me also, which might be interesting and helpful to whoever watches this. I had two recent experiences, and I have done a lot of trauma work. I've done a number of different therapies and modalities and practices to deal with my trauma. But recently, I walked past a man walking with a young girl who must have been around the age of 4. He was holding her hand, and they were just walking. And as they walked past me, I looked at this girl and it triggered a memory of what happened to me when I was 4. And I was filled with a deep, deep sadness for myself, for my 4-year-old self, looking at this girl, imagining that she had to go through a similar experience. So even though I've done a lot of healing, a simple thing like that can trigger the memory and still bring up emotions. It's very interesting. So we never really put it down completely. We do carry it with us. Another interesting experience that I've had, I do strength training. I was doing a specific exercise which literally resembled the force of the sexual abuse that I had experienced. And while I was doing this, it literally triggered a memory in my body, and I had a whole physiological response to it, which was also very interesting. I was fortunate to be with someone who was very, very good at just holding that space for me and helping me to process it, because I could just sit down and let this happen, and go through the experience, because I also have the training to deal with things like that. But it's interesting how going through life you encounter things, do things and activities and things that trigger those memories, or still let you know that there's a bit of residual trauma that you're still holding somewhere in your body that you haven't released yet. So it feels to me that it's my life's work to constantly still process it, still release some of it. And maybe that will be the case forever. And maybe it becomes less and it becomes less intense. But it's interesting what things can trigger, memories of that. Very, very interesting.
It is, and as we know, I think it's well documented that although we know a lot about the brain, but there's still so much that we don't know, and that's
Mm,
really scary in itself.
mm. Yeah, fascinating. I just want to conclude also with one thing that for me, I did say in the beginning, I'm in a situation where I'm still not believed by the people closest to me. The big thing, the most hurtful thing for me is the fact, or that feeling, that nobody ever stood up for me, and nobody still stands up for me in the family context about what happens. And I'm saying that because I know from my own experience and the clients that I work with, there are a lot of people that experience that, as opposed to what you told us from your experience. That is so beautiful, is how people stood up for you and gathered around to protect you and keep you safe, and immediately took action to remove that threat after you
Mm,
were in a situation of having to face that perpetrator for a prolonged period, which we also know that is a complex trauma in itself. It's
mm,
absolutely beautiful. And I want to just acknowledge that there are people in your life who stood up for you and took a firm stance and set it straight and made sure that you were safe the moment that you disclosed it. It's beautiful. And I'm very grateful for that.
Thank you, and I really appreciate you acknowledging that because, like I said, without that, I certainly wouldn't be the man that I am today or the dad that I am today. But on top of that, I think the other big healer for me that's been able to continue is finding my beautiful wife who's
Mm,
really understanding. And I'm not saying that everyone has to find a soulmate or anything, because that's not true, but I believe it certainly helps having
mm.
that, just another safety net and someone that understands and you can talk to, and having that unconditional love. Um, it's like, I just think it's a superpower.
It is. I agree with you. And I love that you call it a superpower. It's absolutely beautiful. And it's so, so important. It makes such a difference if we have that in our lives. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. John, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your experience. I'm very grateful. And I know that this conversation is going to be very helpful and inspiring to many people. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And again, I really appreciate the opportunity and the work that you're doing, and providing an opportunity for people like myself to share our story. So, from my understanding, it's not easy doing podcasts. and editing and doing all the behind the scenes. So I do appreciate that.
Awesome. Thanks.